He refreshed the screen one more time. The number hadn't changed, but he stared at it as if staring long enough might make it mean something different. $11,412 with. It was more money than he had ever held in one place in his entire life. He closed the laptop, walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood over the sink without drinking it. He had done everything right. He had saved it with. And now that it was real, now that the number had commas in it, he felt beneath the quiet pride a low and persistent fear he could not name with. Most people who struggle with money are not struggling because they lack information. They are not confused about compound interest or unaware that spending less than you earn is the foundational principle of building wealth with. They know these things. The knowledge is not the problem. What trips them, what trips almost all of us at some point, is that money doesn't behave the way we expect it to, because money is not really about money with. It is about the invisible architecture of how we were raised, what we survived, what we were told we deserved, and what we quietly believe about our own future. It lives not in spreadsheets but in the body, in the gut instinct that fires before reason has a chance to speak. This is the story of a man named Daniel. He is not a cautionary tale, and he is not a hero. He is someone trying to understand, the way most of us try to understand, slowly, imperfectly, and usually only after the lesson has already been paid for. Over the course of his life, through the choices he made and the ones that were made for him, Daniel came to see that the way we relate to money is really the way we relate to time, to risk, to other people, and to ourselves. That what we do with money is a kind of autobiography written in numbers, and the part he had not yet understood, standing in that kitchen, glass of water untouched, number still glowing on the closed laptop, was not about what he had saved. It was about why the saving had felt, in some room of himself he rarely entered, less like achievement and more like armor. The question was not whether he was doing the right things. The question was what he was doing them for. And that question, quiet as it was, would take years to answer, based on the book The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The rules nobody taught you. On how the money lessons we carry were never really about money. Daniel was 7 years old the first time he understood that money was not just a thing but a feeling. His mother was on the phone with someone from the electric company. He could tell by the way she stood, her back slightly turned, her voice lowered to a register she used only for important conversations, that something was wrong. He did not know the word for it yet, but he felt it in the particular quality of the silence that followed when she hung up. She came back to the kitchen, moved 2 dishes from one side of the counter to the other, for no clear reason, and then looked at him with a smile that was not quite a smile. "It is fine," she said. "Everything is fine." He believed her, because he was 7, but something in him filed the scene away, the lowered voice, the rearranged dishes, the smile that was working hard, and began building, slowly and without his permission, a set of ideas about what money meant and what it felt like when it was scarce. He would not have called it a lesson at the time. It was not a lesson, it was an atmosphere. Children do not learn financial anxiety the way they learn multiplication tables, through repetition and explanation, and a teacher standing at the front of a room. They learn it through accumulation, through 100 small scenes that each individually seem unremarkable. The lowered voice on a Tuesday evening, the slight pause before saying yes to something at the grocery store. The way certain numbers produce a different kind of quiet. Taken one at a time, these moments mean nothing. Taken together over years, they constitute an education, unintentional, thorough, and permanent. We are taught almost nothing useful about money when we are young. We are told, in the vaguest possible terms, that we should save it, that we should not waste it, that it does not grow on trees. Some of us are handed an allowance and expected to absorb through osmosis the mechanics of deferred gratification. A few of us are given a bank account at 12 and a brief, uncomfortable conversation about interest. But what we actually learn about money, the deep curriculum, the one that shapes how we feel when we spend or save or watch a number on a screen go up or down. We learn by watching the adults around us in moments they did not know we were watching with. Daniel learned that money was something that could disappear without warning. He learned that when it was tight, people smiled in ways that were not quite smiles. He learned that certain conversations were held in low voices with, that certain topics were changed when children entered the room. He learned, without anyone telling him, that money was connected to dignity, that having it meant a kind of safety that went beyond the practical with, and not having it meant something that also went beyond the practical, something quieter and more personal and harder to talk about. None of these lessons were wrong exactly. They were responses to real circumstances with. His mother was not a dramatic woman. She was simply a person who had lived in a world where resources could tighten unexpectedly with, and she had developed the emotional reflexes of someone who had learned to manage not just the money but the anxiety around the money, which is its own kind of labor, invisible and exhausting and rarely acknowledged with. What she was doing on those phone calls was not catastrophizing. She was being accurate. And the accuracy of her response is part of what made it land so deep. The problem is not that Daniel absorbed these lessons with. The problem is that he absorbed them at an age when he had no capacity to contextualize them. They did not arrive as this is one possible relationship with money, shaped by specific historical and economic circumstances with. They arrived as truth, as the way things are, as the emotional grammar through which all future experiences with money would be passed and felt. And emotional grammar, once installed with, does not update itself automatically when the facts change. It keeps applying the old rules to the new sentences, and most of the time you do not notice until the sentence comes out wrong and you have no idea why with. Here is a distinction that matters more than most financial advice ever acknowledges. There is a difference between the rules of money and the rules about money you carry in your body with. The rules of money are largely universal and learnable. Spend less than you earn. Let time do the work compound interest requires. Diversify. Avoid catastrophic decisions. These are knowable. They can be read in an afternoon with. The rules you carry in your body are something else. They are yours, assembled from a specific childhood in a specific household in a specific economic moment with. And they run on software that was installed before you were old enough to choose it. The rules of money are software you can update. The rules in your body are more like firmware, deep, largely invisible with, and not easily overwritten by logic alone. Daniel was 31 when he got his first job that paid enough to make saving possible in a way that felt real rather than theoretical. He had worked since he was 16 grocery stores, with late-night shifts at a call center during college, the early years of his career making enough to cover rent and food and not much else. But at 31, something shifted. The number at the end of the month, after the bills, had begun to have a remainder. It was not large, but it was there, and for the first time he was faced with a question that no one had ever actually prepared him to answer. What do you do with money when you have some? What he did with it surprised him. He did not spend it carelessly. He was not someone who went out and bought things he did not need the moment he had money to do so. What he did was subtler and harder to see from the outside. He moved it. He shifted it between accounts. He earmarked it for things that never quite materialized. He made plans for it, revised the plans, started over He read about index funds and then spent 6 months not investing in them while continuing to read about them. He told himself he was being careful. He told himself he was waiting until he understood it better. And both of those things were true, but they were also cover stories for something underneath. A low-grade reluctance to let the money land anywhere permanent, to commit it to a future he was not entirely sure he trusted. A financial advisor, if he had had one at the time, might have told him to simply open an account and start. That the waiting was costing him years of compound growth, that would have been accurate. But it would not have addressed what was actually happening, which had nothing to do with index funds, and everything to do with what Daniel had learned, before he had words for any of it, about what happens when you count on things with. There is a difference between procrastination and hesitation, and it matters to understand which one you are dealing with. Procrastination is avoidance of a task you know you should do, delay in the face of clarity with. Hesitation is something older. It is the body saying wait, not because the logic is unclear, but because somewhere in the system, trust has not yet been established. Daniel was not procrastinating about his savings. He was hesitating with. And hesitation, unlike procrastination, not solved by a better productivity system or a firmer deadline. It resolves, if it resolves, only when the thing underneath it is finally seen with. The economist and writer Morgan Housel observed something seems at first glance almost too simple to be useful. Every person who has ever existed grew up in a different world when it comes to money with. Not a metaphorically different world, a literally different one. The inflation rate of your childhood shapes how you feel about price stability for the rest of your life with. The stock market behavior during the years you first became aware of shapes your intuitions about risk in ways that persist for decades with. The way your parents spoke, or did not speak, about financial stress shapes the emotional register in which you receive and process all subsequent information about money. Two people sitting next to each other in the same office, with earning the same salary, looking at the same investment options, can have entirely different interior experiences of financial security because they were built by different histories. This is not a small observation. It is, in many ways, the foundation of everything that follows from it. If the way we understand money is shaped by personal history rather than universal principle, then a great deal of financial advice that is technically correct, advice that makes complete sense on paper, will fail to reach people not because they lack intelligence or discipline, but because the advice is addressed to the rational mind while the actual decisions are being made somewhere else, in an older and less articulate part of the self. Daniel had read at some point in his late 20s that the best investment strategy is usually the most boring one, that the people who built lasting wealth were rarely the ones making bold moves or catching waves at exactly the right moment. They were the people who did something reasonable and then stayed in their seats for a very long time, He found this advice believable. He even found it reassuring in a way, because it meant the game was not one he had to be brilliant to play, But knowing something is true and being able to act on it consistently are two very different things, And Daniel had noticed, not without some frustration, a gap between what he knew and what he did that no amount of additional knowledge seemed to close. The gap was not ignorance. The gap was history, Consider what it means to grow up in a household where money was reliably scarce, not catastrophically scarce, not poverty in the sense of genuine deprivation, but tight enough that there was always a background hum of financial anxiety, always the sense that the margin was thin and getting thinner, What that does over years is train the nervous system to treat the future as unreliable, to see security as something that could dissolve. And because the nervous system learns faster and more permanently than the intellect, this training outlasts the circumstances that caused it. You can leave that household, you can get a job that pays well, you can build savings, and still, beneath the rational knowledge that things are different now, there is this older system running watchful, suspicious of stability, waiting for the other shoe. This is not weakness, it is adaptation, It is what the brain does with the information it is given during the years when it is most plastic and most trusting. The problem comes when the adaptation that served you in one context gets applied automatically to every context, including the ones where it no longer fits. The nervous system that learned to prepare for loss does not automatically stand down when the threat passes. It keeps watching, It keeps the posture of someone who has been surprised before and would prefer not to be surprised again. Daniel's hesitation to commit his savings to anything permanent was not irrational, seen from the inside, It was a response to a world in which permanence had, at certain formative moments, turned out to be less permanent than advertised. The emotional logic was coherent. It simply belonged to a chapter of his life that had technically, already ended. What does it mean to inherit a financial psychology? The question sounds abstract until you try to answer it concretely. It means that the particular way your stomach tightens when you see an unexpected bill is not random. It was learned. The particular way you feel, guilty or reckless, or deeply satisfied. When you make a large purchase was not born with you. It was assembled, piece by piece, from the emotional evidence available to you during the years when your interpretation of the world was still being formed. Your feelings about money are a kind of inheritance, as real as any other, and like most inheritances, they arrive without documentation. No one hands you a list of what you have received. You simply live with it for years sometimes, before you understand that you are living with something that was given. There is a particular kind of conversation that almost never happens in families, and its absence has consequences that compound over decades. The conversation would sound something like this: here is what money meant in our household, and here is why. Here is the fear that lived underneath our financial decisions, and here are the specific experiences that created that fear. Here is what I learned about money before I knew I was learning anything, and here is what I think that may have gotten wrong. This conversation almost never happens, not because families are secretive or uncaring, but because the adults who would need to have it are, for the most part, unaware that the lesson is being transmitted. They are not teaching, they are simply living, and children are learning from the living. He was 34 when he first talked to anyone about any of this. Not a therapist and not a financial advisor. He talked to his older sister, Maya, on a Sunday afternoon when they had somehow ended up in a longer conversation than either had planned. She was 6 years older than him, which meant she had watched those same kitchen scenes from a different vantage point. With a few more years of context, she had her own version of the lessons. But where Daniel had learned to hold money loosely, to avoid committing it to anything that might disappoint him, Maya had learned to grip. She spent very little. She saved aggressively and felt guilty when she spent on herself, even on things that were clearly reasonable and affordable. 2 children, same house, same childhood, and they had arrived at adulthood with mirror image responses to the same underlying wound. This is, when you look closely, one of the more quietly astonishing things about the way financial psychology works. The same set of experiences does not produce the same adaptation in every person who lives through it. 2 siblings in the same household watching the same scenes can develop opposite behavioral responses, one who loosens, one who tightens, both of them doing so for the same reason, both trying to protect themselves from the same fear. The form the protection takes depends on something subtle. What each person, in their private interpretation of those years, decided was the cause of the danger and the likeliest path away from it. Spend less and you will be safe. Hold loosely and you will be ready. 2 strategies, 1 wound. I do not think either of us actually believes we will be okay, Maya said, not accusingly, just as an observation. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, one of her kids was yelling something about a bicycle. I think we both believe that if we do the right things, we will be okay. But that is different. Daniel did not answer right away. He looked at the table and thought about the number on his laptop screen, and the glass of water he had not drunk, and the pride and the fear that had arrived together and would not separate. And he thought, she is right, He had been doing the right things with a background belief that doing the right things was no guarantee of anything. That security was something you could approach but never quite reach. That the ground could always shift which meant, in a way he had not quite articulated until that afternoon, that he was saving not from a position of confidence but from a position of fear. And while the outcome might look the same on a spreadsheet, the experience was entirely different. The person saving from confidence makes a choice each month, and the choice feels like agency, like authorship, like the deliberate construction of a future they believe in. The person saving from fear makes the same choice and feels, underneath the discipline, something closer to bracing. The motion is identical. The interior experience is not, with. There is a concept that rarely appears in personal finance books, despite being arguably more important than most of what does: the role of psychological safety in financial decision-making, with. The idea is this: our ability to think clearly about long-term trade-offs degrades significantly when we are operating from a place of scarcity mindset, regardless of whether actual scarcity exists, with. When the nervous system has been trained to anticipate loss, it allocates cognitive resources differently. It shortens the time horizon. It treats the future as less real than the present, with. It favors the certain small thing over the uncertain large thing, even when the uncertain large thing is, by any objective measure, the better bet, with. This is why behavior matters more than knowledge in financial life, not as a moral judgment, but as a mechanical observation. You can know, intellectually, that staying invested through market downturns is the rational choice, with. You can have read the studies, understood the compounding math, internalized the historical data, and then the market drops 20%, and everything you know gets very quiet, with. And what speaks loudly is the thing that learned about money before it knew any of those words. The knowledge does not disappear. It simply becomes, in that moment, much less persuasive than the feeling, with. Daniel was 37 when he lost a significant portion of his savings. Not all of it, nothing catastrophic, but enough to matter. When he pulled his investments during a downturn that turned out to be temporary, with. He had watched the number fall for 3 weeks. He had told himself repeatedly that the correct thing was to hold. He had even written himself a note, in the deliberate way he had read about in a book, with. Reminding himself of what he knew and what he had decided in calmer moments. And then one Tuesday morning he sold anyway. Not because he had reconsidered the logic, because the older, faster system had spoken, with. And the note on his phone had felt very far away. He sat with the decision for a long time afterward, not berating himself. That was not his style, but turning it over, trying to understand what had actually happened, with. He had not panicked in any simple sense. He had thought about it carefully. He had slept on it several nights in a row. He had gone through a kind of internal deliberation that felt, from the inside, like careful reasoning, with. And he had arrived at the wrong answer anyway, not because the reasoning was flawed, but because the reasoning was taking place inside a framework that had been quietly shaped, years before he was old enough to question it, with. By a set of experiences that taught him certain things about what happens when numbers go down. He was not stupid. He was not undisciplined, with. He was someone who had not yet found a way to bring his history and his knowledge into the same room and let them talk to each other. Daniel thought about this on the drive home from his sister's house that Sunday, with. He had not come looking for any particular insight. They had started by talking about their mother, with. And then about a small inheritance they had both received a few years earlier and handled completely differently. Maya had invested hers immediately, without much deliberation, in conservative funds she chose in an afternoon, with. Daniel had held his in a savings account for 14 months, moving it several times, telling himself he was still deciding. He had not invested it until after it had already lost real value to inflation. The contrast, with. When Maya pointed it out gently, was not a source of shame. It was a source of data. And Daniel had, over the years, become someone who could receive data about himself without immediately converting it into a verdict, with. He was learning slowly to approach his own financial behavior the way a good diagnostician approaches a symptom, with curiosity rather than judgment. The question was not what is wrong with me, with. The question was, what is this behavior telling me about what I believe? Because beneath every financial behavior, however irrational it appears from the outside, there is a belief. And beneath the belief, almost always, with. There is an experience. The experience is real. The belief may have been the correct interpretation of the experience at the time it was formed, with. The question is simply whether it still applies. Whether the map drawn during one chapter of life is still accurate in this one. The deepest shift in how Daniel eventually came to think about money was not a change in strategy, with. It was a change in the question he was asking. He had spent years asking, how do I manage money better? A question that sent him toward tools, systems, rules, spreadsheets, and books with 5-step frameworks. These were not useless, but they were answers to a question that was sitting one level above the real one. The real question, the one that took him longest to articulate and longest to sit with once he had, was this: what does money mean to me? And where did that meaning come from? Not as an intellectual exercise, as a genuine inquiry into the invisible curriculum he had received before he was old enough to audit it. This is, in the end, the work that no spreadsheet can do. You can automate your savings, you can set up investment accounts and configure automatic contributions and build systems that remove the need for willpower on any given morning. These are all genuinely useful things, but they do not reach the part of you that will quietly dismantle the system when the fear grows loud enough. They do not reach the belief that the ground might shift. They do not reach the 7-year-old who is still, in some room of you, watching and filing and building a picture of what the world is like when it comes to money. That part of you is not reached by optimization. It is reached by attention, by the slow, patient work of noticing what you actually feel when money is involved, and asking gently and without verdict where that feeling came from. The rules nobody taught Daniel were not about index funds or asset allocation or the importance of starting early. Those are learnable, important, genuinely useful, and learnable. The rules nobody taught him were the ones he had already learned, without knowing it, in a kitchen at age 7, watching his mother rearrange dishes that did not need to be moved. Those rules were already running. They had been running for 30 years, and until he could name them, he could not choose whether to follow them. That is where his story, and perhaps yours, actually begins. Not with a budget, not with a better system, with a kitchen, with a woman moving dishes, with a 7-year-old watching and understanding and beginning to build something that would take 3 more decades to finally see clearly. Chapter 2. The Wind You Didn't Choose. On luck, circumstance, and the stories we tell about why we ended up where we did there is a man Daniel has thought about for years without ever meeting him. His name was Robert, and Daniel heard about him the way you hear about most people who change the way you think. Secondhand, through a story told at the wrong moment in the right room. Robert had grown up 2 blocks from Daniel's father, in the same neighborhood in the same decade, attending the same underfunded school with the same rotating cast of teachers who were doing their best under circumstances that made best a relative term. They had the same starting point in almost every way that can be measured. And yet, by the time Daniel heard about him, Robert had spent the last 11 years working a job he despised in order to pay down a debt that had started as a reasonable response to a single bad year and had compounded through a series of decisions that each made sense in isolation, into something that had rearranged the entire shape of his life. Daniel's father, meanwhile, had done well, not spectacularly, not the kind of well that gets talked about, but quietly, steadily well. He owned a small home. He had retired at 63 with enough to be comfortable. He had not made brilliant financial moves. He had simply been in the right place, several times, at moments that mattered enormously, and that he had not chosen and could not have predicted. The first was a job offer that arrived in 1987 from a company that was, at the time, unremarkable, a mid-sized logistics firm that happened to offer a pension and happened to survive 3 subsequent recessions while most of its competitors folded. The second was a house he bought in a neighborhood that felt, at the time, like a compromise, not where he wanted to live, but what he could afford, which turned out to sit directly in the path of a development corridor that tripled property values over the following 15 years. The third was a medical scare that turned out to be nothing, but that scared him enough to buy life insurance at 38, which meant that when the real medical crisis came at 51, his family was protected. None of these were decisions made from wisdom. They were decisions made from availability, from constraint, from fear, from luck. And yet their cumulative effect was a life that looked, from the outside, like the product of discipline and foresight. This is the pattern that most honest accounts of financial success quietly omit. Not because the people involved are dishonest, but because the human mind is genuinely, structurally poor at attributing outcomes to forces outside its own agency. We are meaning-making creatures. When something good happens, we search for the cause, and the cause we find most easily, most naturally, most satisfyingly, is ourselves. The choices we made, the discipline we showed, the foresight we exercised. This is not vanity, it is neurology. The brain that cannot draw a line between its own actions and the results of those actions is a brain that cannot learn, so it draws the line always as directly as possible. And in doing so, it systematically underweights everything that was happening outside its control. Daniel did not arrive at this understanding easily. It took him the better part of his 30s to begin to see it, and even then he arrived at it not through philosophy but through envy, which is perhaps the most honest route. He had a colleague named Priya who had joined the same company at the same level in the same year with what appeared to be roughly equivalent qualifications. Within 4 years, she had been promoted twice and was earning nearly 40% more than Daniel. He watched this happen with the particular attentiveness of someone who is trying very hard not to feel what they are feeling. He told himself she was more talented. He told himself she worked harder. He told himself, in the slightly desperate way of someone constructing a story that will hold, that there were good reasons for this disparity that had nothing to do with anything unfair. And then, one afternoon, he found out almost by accident that Priya had been hired through a direct referral from a board member who had known her family for 20 years, that her first major project had succeeded largely because it had been assigned to her during a period when the company was flush with contract revenue and willing to absorb its failures, a window that had closed 6 months later, that her second promotion had come from a manager who had a known preference for a particular style of presentation that Priya happened to use naturally and that Daniel had never been taught. None of this made Priya less capable. She was genuinely talented. She had worked hard. The promotions were not undeserved, but they were also not purely deserved. Not in the clean, linear way that the story he had been telling himself required. They were the product of talent and effort, and a specific constellation of circumstances that had nothing to do with talent or effort, all of it braided together in a way that made it nearly impossible to separate one strand from another. This is the thing about luck that makes it so difficult to discuss honestly. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive wearing a sign. It arrives dressed as opportunity, as timing, as personality fit, as the right conversation at the right moment, as a market that happened to be expanding in exactly the direction you happen to be moving. And because it arrives in disguise, we do not recognize it for what it is. We recognize it as the consequence of something we did. We absorb it into our autobiography. We call it the result of showing up, of being prepared, of having the courage to take the chance. And sometimes those things are true. And sometimes the chance was already halfway to landing before we reached for it. Morgan Housel writes about 2 investors, one who got rich and one who did not, whose stories, on the surface, read as parables of discipline versus recklessness. But underneath the surface, the decisive variable was not character. It was the specific years in which each man came of age financially. One entered the market during a decade of sustained growth and experienced, early in his investing life, the kind of returns that create confidence and reinforce patience. The other entered during a contraction, experienced early losses that were not the result of poor decisions but of poor timing, and developed, reasonably, understandably, a risk aversion that would limit him for the rest of his financial life. Same intelligence, same basic instincts, different decades, vastly different outcomes. The year you were born is not a choice. The neighborhood you grew up in is not a choice. The employer who happened to be hiring when you happened to need a job is not a choice. The market conditions that existed when you first had money to invest are not a choice. These things happen to you, and then, For the rest of your life, you make choices inside the space those things created, a space you did not design and cannot fully see from within. Daniel thought about Robert again when he was 39, at a dinner party where someone made a casual remark about people who end up in debt as the result of poor decisions. The remark was not unkind. It was said without malice, as an obvious truth that needed no examination, and it landed in Daniel with a weight that surprised him, because he knew by then, enough of Robert's actual story to know that the word decisions was doing a great deal of work that the word circumstances should have been doing instead. Robert had taken on the debt during a period when his wife was ill, the illness was not catastrophic, but it was persistent and expensive in the particular way that persistent illnesses are. Not a single large cost, but a continuous accumulation of moderate ones that don't qualify for catastrophic coverage and don't stop. He had borrowed to cover the gap. The interest rate had been higher than he would have chosen if he had had more options. He had not had more options. He had had the options available to someone in his income bracket, in his credit bracket, during a specific economic moment that made borrowing more expensive for the people who could least afford expensive borrowing and cheaper for the people who needed it least. This is the geometry of financial disadvantage that rarely appears in conversations about personal responsibility. The people most vulnerable to bad financial outcomes are also, structurally, the people with access to the worst financial products. The cost of being poor, the fees, the rates, the terms, is higher than the cost of being wealthy in almost every financial category. This is not an accident of the market, it is a feature of how risk is priced and who absorbs it. And yet the story we tell about financial failure focuses almost exclusively on the choices made within that structure, and almost never on the structure itself. What makes this particularly difficult to sit with is that the alternative, the story in which outcomes are purely the product of choices, is so much more comfortable, and not only for the obvious reasons. There is something genuinely useful about believing in the direct relationship between effort and reward. It motivates. It creates a sense of agency that is itself a resource. People who believe their actions matter tend to take more of them, and taking more actions, on average, produces better outcomes than taking fewer. The belief in personal agency is, in a real sense, self-fulfilling. This is not nothing, it is actually quite a lot. The problem is not the belief itself. The problem is when the belief becomes so total that it crowds out any account of the forces operating alongside it. Daniel came to think of this as the difference between credit and causation. You can take credit for what you built without claiming that you were the sole cause of it. You can acknowledge your effort and your choices while also acknowledging that the context in which those choices were made was not of your design. These two things are not in conflict. They only feel like they are in conflict because we have been trained, by a culture that treats financial success as a moral outcome, to see acknowledgement of luck as a diminishment of achievement, as if saying the wind helped means saying I did not row. Both things can be true at the same time. The rower matters, the wind matters. Pretending the wind is not there does not make you a better rower. It just makes you a worse forecaster. There was a period in Daniel's late 30s when he spent a great deal of time reading about people who had built significant wealth, not to learn their strategies, which varied enormously and often contradicted each other, but to understand something else. He was trying to find the variable, the thing that explained the outcome. What he found repeatedly was not a variable but a cluster. The people who had done well had, almost without exception, combined genuine skill or effort with at least one moment of what could only honestly be called fortune, a connection that opened a door, a market that moved in their direction, a circumstance that had protected them from a loss that would have been, in different timing, ruinous. The skill was real, the effort was real, and so was the fortune. All three were present, always in some proportion. The proportion varied, but the fortune was never absent. He read about a study, one of those studies that sounds counterintuitive, until you sit with it long enough for the counterintuition to become obvious, in which researchers tracked the financial outcomes of people with identical measurable qualifications over 20 years, with same education, same industry, same entry-level salary. The spread in outcomes at the end of 20 years was enormous, far larger than any difference in qualifications or initial conditions could explain, with the researchers attributed a substantial portion of the variance to what they called contextual factors: the specific employer at entry, the manager in the first 3 years, the geographic market during key earning periods, with the health events that did or did not occur. These were not merit variables, they were circumstance variables, and they were doing as much work in some cohorts, with more work, than the merit variables in determining where people ended up. This does not mean merit is irrelevant, with it means merit is necessary but not sufficient, a distinction that sounds academic until you apply it to someone you know. Daniel applied it to Robert, he applied it to his father, he applied it to Priya, he applied it with eventually and with some difficulty to himself. And what he found each time was not a simpler story but a truer one. A story in which people were doing the best they could with what they had, with inside a structure they had not designed, at moments they had not chosen, in winds that were sometimes at their backs and sometimes directly in their faces, and that no one around them was naming out loud the naming matters, with not as an intellectual exercise, but as a practical one. The person who cannot name the role of circumstance in their own story cannot learn the right lessons from their own experience, with they will attribute a lucky outcome to a smart decision and repeat the smart decision in a context where the luck is no longer present and wonder why it does not work the same way twice, with they will attribute a bad outcome to a bad decision when the decision was reasonable and the circumstances were simply unkind, and they will carry an unearned guilt that distorts every subsequent choice, with the inability to accurately attribute outcomes to their actual causes is not just philosophically imprecise. It is a practical liability that compounds over time. Daniel was not, by the time he understood this, with someone who used it as an excuse for his own inaction. That was not where the insight led him. What it led him toward was something more nuanced and, ultimately, with more useful, a recalibration of how he assessed both his own outcomes and other people's. A recognition that the line between a good decision and a good result is not as straight as it appears, with that someone can make every reasonable choice available to them and still end up in a difficult place because the choices available to them were already limited by forces they did not create, with and that someone can make mediocre choices and end up in a comfortable place because the forces operating in their favor were strong enough to absorb the mediocrity. This does not mean outcomes are random, with it means they are composite, built from agency and circumstance in proportions that vary wildly from one person's life to the next, and that are, from the inside, almost impossible to accurately measure, with there is a particular kind of humility that this understanding requires, and it is not the false humility of someone performing modesty about their achievements, with it is the real and somewhat disorienting humility of recognizing that you cannot fully know how much of what you have built was you. That the confidence you feel in your own judgment is partly the confidence of someone who has been, with in ways both visible and invisible, fortunate, and that the person who made the same choices you made and ended up somewhere worse may not have made worse choices. They may simply have made those choices in a different wind, with Daniel had a conversation with his father a few years before his father died that he has never entirely been able to leave behind. He had asked, directly and without preamble. They were the kind of family that could do that, with when the moment was right. How much of what you built do you think was luck? His father had been quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone stalling, but the quiet of someone genuinely calculating, which Daniel had not expected, with he had expected deflection. He had expected the standard story, hard work, discipline, the choices I made. Instead, his father said, more than I ever admitted when it mattered, with and then he said something that Daniel wrote down afterward, not because it was eloquent, but because it was honest in a way that felt rare. The problem with luck is that you only see it clearly in retrospect. When it is happening, it just feels like things going the way they should. You do not experience it as fortune. You experience it as confirmation. Confirmation of what Daniel had asked of the story you were already telling about yourself his father said. This is perhaps the most important and least comfortable insight about the role of luck in financial life. It is invisible not because it is subtle, but because we are motivated not to see it. The mind that sees luck clearly is a mind that must hold its own achievements more loosely. It must be willing to say some of this was me, and some of this was circumstances I did not choose, and I cannot always tell which is which. That is a genuinely difficult thing to live with, more difficult in many ways than simply believing you earned what you have. The belief that your outcomes reflect your choices is not just comforting, it is generative. It motivates continued effort, it creates agency. These are not trivial things, but it has a shadow side that Daniel had come to take seriously. The person who attributes all of their success to their own decisions will, inevitably, attribute all of other people's failures to their decisions as well. The same logic that says I succeeded because of my discipline says they failed because of their lack of it. And this is where a personal psychological comfort, the belief in one's own agency, becomes a social blindness. It makes the invisible structure invisible twice, once to the person navigating it and once to the people observing from the outside. Prior, when Daniel eventually knew her well enough to have the conversation, had thought about this too. Not in the same terms, but in the same direction. She said something that he had turned over many times since. The most dangerous version of confidence is the kind that cannot locate its own preconditions. Because if you cannot see what made you possible, you cannot extend that to anyone else. You just see people who are trying and people who are not. There is also the question of what this understanding does to the way you hold other people's failures. Daniel noticed, over time, that his capacity for patience with people in financial difficulty had changed, not because he had become less careful with his own decisions, but because he had become more honest about the degree to which his own relative stability was a joint product. When someone told him they were struggling, he had stopped reaching automatically for the question of what choices had led them there. He had started asking first, what was the structure they were navigating? What were the options actually available to them? What was the wind doing in the years that mattered most? These were not questions that absolved anyone of anything. They were questions that added resolution to a picture that was previously too low in detail to see clearly. His father had once said, in a different conversation on a different afternoon, that the most generous thing a person can do is extend to others the same complicated grace they extend to themselves. Daniel had not understood this at the time. He had thought it was a vague kind of niceness. It took him years to understand that it was, in fact, a precise and demanding instruction. The grace we extend to ourselves in our better moments, the recognition that we are doing the best we can, inside circumstances we did not fully choose, is exactly the grace that becomes hardest to extend to other people when their circumstances look different from ours. And it is exactly then, in that moment of distance, that the instruction matters most. The pattern in Daniel's financial life was not just a pattern about money. It was a pattern about attribution, about the stories we tell to explain why things turned out the way they did, and who gets credit and who gets blame in those stories. Money is simply where the stakes are high enough that the pattern becomes visible. The person who cannot see luck in their financial life cannot see it in their professional life, their relational life, their life overall. The incapacity is general. It just shows up most clearly in the places where the outcomes are most measurable and the tendency to claim them most strong. Daniel thought about Robert one last time on an evening in early winter, sitting at the kitchen table where he had grown up, going through some of his father's old papers after the funeral. He found in a manila folder labeled simply insurance, the policy his father had bought in 1994, the one purchased from fear, from a scare that turned out to be nothing. Stapled behind it was a note in his father's handwriting, undated, that said only, "Bought this because I was scared," with "Glad I was." It was 3 lines. It was not wisdom. It was not a strategy. It was a man responding to a moment of fear in a way that happened to protect his family 17 years later, with during a crisis neither of them could have imagined. The fear was real, the protection was real, and the distance between them, between the scared moment and the protected outcome, was time and luck and the particular mercy of a crisis that arrived after rather than before. Daniel is still working this out. He does not have it resolved and he doubts it ever fully resolves. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because the honest answer keeps shifting quietly and steadily as the evidence accumulates. New things go well, new things go badly. Each time the work is the same, to hold what happened without immediately converting it into a story that assigns all the credit or all the blame to a single cause, to stay in the more uncomfortable and more accurate space of both. He has learned to pause when things go well and ask the question his father eventually taught him to ask, not as self-deprecation but as calibration. How much of this was me? And how much of this was the specific wind that happened to be blowing in my direction on the days that mattered most, before I even knew they were the days that mattered? He folded the papers back into the folder and sat with them for a long while. Outside, the street was quiet and still. He did not know, sitting there at that table, what specific decisions would follow from this understanding. He did not know what he would do differently, but he knew that the question had changed. And when the question changes, even before the answers do, even before anything visible shifts, something important has already begun. Chapter 3. The cost of wanting more. On enough, the moving goalpost, and the difference between wealth and its appearance. Daniel was 41 the first time he genuinely had enough, and discovered, with a discomfort he had not anticipated, that he did not know what to do with that fact. He had been saving for 15 years with the low-grade urgency of someone outrunning a fear they could not name. He had automated his contributions, learned to live on less than he earned, avoided the kind of consumer debt that had swallowed people he knew. He had done, in other words, everything he was supposed to do. And by 41, the numbers reflected it. Not wealthy, not by any dramatic measure, but stable. More stable than he had ever been. More stable, he suspected, than anyone in his family had been at this age. The account balances, when he pulled them up on a Tuesday evening with a glass of water beside him, were what he had been working toward for the better part of a decade. He closed the laptop. He sat there for a moment. And then he opened it again, navigated to a real estate site he had bookmarked months earlier, and spent 40 minutes looking at houses he could not afford. He noticed what he was doing. He had enough of that self-awareness by then to notice, But noticing and stopping are different operations, and that evening they did not connect. He looked at the houses with the focused attention of someone working on something important, and when he finally set the laptop aside, the feeling that had accompanied the savings milestone, the quiet satisfaction, the sense of arrival, had been replaced by something else. A vague restlessness, a low-frequency dissatisfaction with where he was, now measured against where those houses were. He had moved the goalpost. He knew it. He had moved it so quickly and so naturally that he had not even noticed the motion until the new goal was already in place, shining there in the distance, making the thing he had just achieved feel like a starting point rather than a destination. This is one of the quietest and most persistent mechanisms in the psychology of money, and it is almost never discussed in the terms it deserves. We talk about ambition as though it is uncomplicated, as though wanting more is simply the engine of progress, the thing that gets you up in the morning and keeps you moving forward. And it is those things, but it is also, under certain conditions and at certain intensities, a kind of trap. Not a moral failing, a structural feature of how the human mind experiences acquisition. The wanting is designed to be renewable. The satisfaction is designed to be temporary. The system does not reach equilibrium. It recalibrates. The technical name for this is hedonic adaptation, and it has been studied extensively enough that its basic mechanics are no longer in serious dispute. We adjust faster than we expect and more completely than we hope to improvements in our circumstances. The raise that was going to change everything changes everything for a few weeks and then becomes the new baseline. The house that was going to make you feel settled makes you feel settled until you visit someone with a bigger one. The savings milestone that was going to give you security gives you security until you read an article about what security actually requires, at which point your number and their number trade places and the milestone recedes into insufficiency. Daniel had read about this. He knew the concept. Knowing a concept and feeling it dissolve your satisfaction in real time are, again, different operations. Knowledge is not inoculation. Understanding hedonic adaptation does not protect you from it any more than understanding that optical illusions exist prevents you from seeing them. The mind does what it does. The question is what you choose to do with the mind while it is doing it. The deeper problem, the one that took Daniel longer to see, was not the adaptation itself. It was the way the adaptation had been weaponized by a culture that profits from perpetual dissatisfaction. The houses he had been looking at were not random intrusions. They had been placed in his attention with considerable deliberateness by algorithms and advertising systems and an entire economic infrastructure built on the precise and reliable human tendency to compare upward. The comparison was not accidental, it was engineered. And it worked on Daniel, educated, self-aware, financially literate Daniel, with the same efficiency it worked on everyone else, because knowing you are being manipulated does not in practice do very much to reduce the manipulation's effectiveness. He thought about a neighbor from his childhood, a man named Gerald who had retired at 58 after a career as an electrician, who lived in the same modest house he had bought at 32, who drove the same kind of truck he had always driven, and who seemed in a way Daniel had not understood as a child and only began to understand as an adult, genuinely contented, not resigned, not checked out, contented. Gerald had a phrase he used when people asked him about retirement, about whether he wished he had done more, saved more, aimed higher. He would shrug with the ease of someone who had long ago settled a question others were still fighting and say, "I knew what enough looked like a long time ago. Most people never figure that out." Daniel had heard this as a child and filed it away as something old people said, a comfortable rationalization for limited ambition, the kind of thing you told yourself when the grander options had already closed. He understood it differently now. What Gerald had was not low ambition, it was something rarer and more valuable, a defined endpoint, a number, or more accurately, a feeling, a quality of life, a set of conditions that he had named and held and refused to let the culture renegotiate on his behalf. He had decided what enough looked like before the machinery of comparison had a chance to make the decision for him. And in doing so, he had opted out of a game that Daniel, at 41, was still playing without entirely knowing the rules. The rules of the game, as Daniel had come to understand them, are approximately these. First, the goalpost always moves, not randomly but in a specific direction, always further, always larger, always more. Second, the movement is socially calibrated, which means it accelerates in environments where the people around you have more, and decelerates in environments where they have less. Third, the movement is invisible while it is happening. You do not experience the goalpost moving. You experience your current position becoming insufficient. The inadequacy feels internal, personal, a function of your own failure to achieve, not a function of an external standard that has been quietly revised upward while you were busy meeting the last one. This third rule is the one that does the most damage. Because if the inadequacy feels internal, you address it internally. You work harder, earn more, save more, acquire more, and you do achieve more often. And the achievement is real and produces real satisfaction. For a moment, for a season, sometimes for a year. And then the baseline shifts again, and the dissatisfaction returns, and it feels again like a personal failure rather than a structural inevitability. And the cycle continues with, the game has no winning condition. It has only continued play. Daniel had a conversation around this time with a man named Elliot, a former colleague, who had, by any external measure, done spectacularly well with. Elliot had started a company in his late 30s, sold it a decade later for a sum that placed him, in a single transaction, into a category of wealth that Daniel could not entirely conceptualize. He had the house with. He had multiple houses. He had the kind of financial freedom that Daniel had held as a distant abstraction for most of his adult life. And when Daniel, emboldened by an unusually candid evening and one glass of wine beyond his usual limit, asked Elliot whether it felt the way he had imagined it would, Elliot had been quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Eventually, Elliot said, "The number was everything I thought it would be." For about 3 months, And then I found out what the people who sold for twice as much had done with their companies, and I spent a year feeling like I had left money on the table. Which I had, But I had also built something real and sold it for a life-changing amount of money. Both things were true. I could only feel one of them, This is the particular cruelty of comparison wealth. The wealth measured not against a standard of sufficiency, but against the wealth of others, always others who have slightly more. It is not a feature of exceptional greed, It is a feature of normal human social cognition applied to a domain where it produces consistently destructive results. We are wired to track relative position. For most of human history, this was adaptive. Knowing where you stood in the social hierarchy had direct survival implications, The problem is that the same cognitive machinery that once told you whether you had enough grain for the winter now tells you whether your retirement account is large enough relative to your neighbors, and it applies the same existential urgency to both calculations regardless of whether the urgency is warranted. Daniel began, around this time, to take seriously a question that sounds simple but proved, in practice, to be among the most demanding he had ever tried to answer honestly. What do I actually want money for? Not in the abstract, not as an investment thesis or a retirement target. What specific quality of life, what concrete set of freedoms and possibilities was he actually working toward? What would the life he wanted feel like from the inside on an ordinary Tuesday, and how much money did that life actually require? The question resisted easy answers. He had spent so long in the logic of more savings, more security, more runway, that the question of what the more was for had become strangely difficult to access. It was like asking someone who has been walking very fast in a specific direction what they are walking toward. The walking had become the point. The direction had become self-justifying. The destination had been replaced by the motion. He tried to answer the question honestly over several weeks, in the way he sometimes approached problems that mattered, writing things down not to record them but to find out what he thought. What he discovered, when he cleared away the ambient noise of comparison and aspiration and the vague cultural instruction to want more, was that what he actually wanted was surprisingly modest. He wanted work he found meaningful and not too much of it, He wanted time, unscheduled, unoptimized, genuinely free time, in a quantity that his current life only intermittently allowed. He wanted security deep enough that a bad month did not produce panic. He wanted to be able to be generous with the people he cared about without calculating the cost each time. That was most of it. The specifics were not complicated, and when he compared that list to what he actually had, the gap was smaller than the restlessness had suggested. Not zero, there were real things still to build, real freedoms still constrained. But the gap between where he was and where he needed to be was not the vast, urgent chasm that the goalpost's perpetual motion implied. It was a manageable distance. It could be crossed with patience and reasonable effort. It did not require the kind of aggressive, relentless accumulation that the machinery of comparison had been quietly recommending. This realization did not resolve the restlessness. That is important to say clearly, Because the story of this kind of insight is often told as a conversion, as the moment when someone sees through the illusion and is freed from it. That was not what happened for Daniel. What happened was more like a gradual shift in the quality of his awareness. He still felt the pull of the goalpost. He still looked at things he did not have and felt the low hum of wanting. But he had begun to be able to name the mechanism while it was operating, which changed his relationship to it even when it did not change the feeling itself. Naming a thing is not the same as defeating it, but it is the prerequisite for any genuine choice about whether to follow it. There is a distinction that Morgan Housel draws, one that Daniel returned to many times once he encountered it, between being wealthy and being rich. Rich is visible. Rich is the car, the house, the vacation, the consumption that signals to others and confirms to yourself that you have arrived somewhere. Rich requires an audience. It derives its meaning, in part, from comparison, from being seen to have more than the baseline. Wealthy is different. Wealthy is invisible by nature. Wealthy is the money you have not spent, the options it preserves, the freedom it represents, the cushion it provides against the shocks that cannot be predicted. Wealthy does not require an audience. It does not need to be seen to mean something. It means something regardless of whether anyone is looking. The problem is that we cannot see wealth. We can see richness. We can see the house and the car and the vacation. We cannot see the investment account, the paid-off debt, the emergency fund sitting quietly in a savings account, generating modest interest and enormous peace of mind. This invisibility means that the social comparison machinery, which operates on visible signals, consistently misreads financial health. The person who looks rich may be fragile underneath the display. The person who looks ordinary may be profoundly secure. The signals we use to calibrate our sense of where we stand are systematically misleading, and we calibrate against them anyway, because they are what we can see. Daniel had a colleague in his 40s whose consumption was conspicuous enough to register. New car every 2 years. Vacations posted with careful attention to maximum impressiveness. A house that was, by any measure, more house than the family required. Daniel had spent years in the ambient assumption that this colleague was wealthy, that the display reflected an underlying substance. He found out, through a mutual friend and a conversation he had not sought, that the colleague was carrying debt in amounts that would have kept Daniel awake for months. The display was not wealth. The display was the opposite of wealth. It was the liquidation of future options in exchange for present appearances. It was richness purchased on credit, which is to say it was not richness at all. It was a performance of richness, maintained at the cost of the actual security that richness is supposed to represent. This is the deepest contradiction at the center of how wealth gets displayed and understood in most social contexts. The things that make you look wealthy tend to reduce your wealth. The things that build actual wealth tend to be invisible, and therefore socially unrewarded, and therefore psychologically difficult to sustain in a culture where the social reward is much of the motivation. The person who drives a modest car and maxes out their retirement account every year and lives comfortably within their income receives no external signal that they are doing something admirable. There is no display to be seen. There is no comparison to win. There is only the private knowledge of a growing number in an account that nobody can see, and the question of whether that private knowledge is enough to sustain the behavior in the absence of social reinforcement. For many people, it is not. And this is not a character failure. It is a design problem, a mismatch between the social environment we actually inhabit and the financial behavior that environment actually rewards, versus the financial behavior that would serve our long-term interests. We are social animals navigating a financial world that punishes social instincts. The instinct to signal status, to compare upward, to display sufficiency. These are not vices. They are deeply human. The challenge is to make financial decisions that serve your actual interests rather than your comparative ones, in a world specifically designed to make the comparative interests feel more urgent and more real. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from perpetual wanting, and it is distinct from the exhaustion of hard work or the tiredness of a difficult day. It is an exhaustion of orientation, the fatigue of a compass that is always spinning, never settling, never pointing at a place you are allowed to rest. Daniel had felt it for years without naming it. It showed up in the low-grade inability to enjoy what he had without simultaneously cataloging what was missing. It showed up in the way a good month financially could be followed almost immediately by anxiety about whether the next month would hold. It showed up in the particular pleasure he was unable to take in things he owned, because owning them had already converted them from wanted to merely possessed, and the wanting had already moved on to the next thing. What he eventually understood was that the wanting was not about the things. The things were proxies. What the wanting was actually pointing at, beneath the houses and the cars and the account balances, was safety. The original need, the one installed in a kitchen at age 7, was for security so complete that the ground could not shift. And no amount of money can provide that, because the ground is always capable of shifting. The safety that money provides is real but bounded. It reduces the range and severity of certain risks. It does not eliminate the fundamental precariousness of being alive in a world that does not come with guarantees. And the mind that is using accumulation as a substitute for the certainty it cannot have will keep accumulating past any rational threshold, because no threshold can deliver what it is actually looking for. This is the thing that distinguishes financial anxiety from financial prudence. Prudence is calibrated. It responds to actual risk with proportionate preparation. Anxiety is uncalibrated. It responds to the memory of risk, to the emotional residue of past scarcity, with preparation that has no natural upper limit because it is not responding to a present condition, but to a fear that was formed in different circumstances and has never been fully updated. The prudent person saves enough to be secure. The anxious person saves past security and keeps going, because security is not actually the goal. The elimination of fear is the goal, and no amount of saving can accomplish that because the fear does not live in the bank account. It lives somewhere older and harder to reach. Daniel had come to see his own wanting as a mixed signal. Part of it was legitimate, the genuine desire for a better life, for more freedom, for the real and practical benefits that financial stability provides. That part was worth following, worth building toward, worth the discipline and patience it required. But underneath it, and harder to disentangle, was the other part. The wanting that came from the 7-year-old who had filed that kitchen scene away and concluded, before he had the language to conclude anything, that you could never quite have enough because enough could always be taken. That part was not pointing at a real target. It was generating motion without destination, urgency without endpoint, a perpetual forward lean that felt like ambition and functioned like avoidance. Knowing the difference between these two kinds of wanting, the legitimate and the compensatory, is not simple. They feel similar from the inside. They produce the same restlessness, the same forward pressure, the same sense that more is needed. The way Daniel had learned to tell them apart, imperfectly and not always reliably, was by asking what the arrival would actually feel like. When he imagined reaching the next milestone, the next account balance, the next acquisition, what did he imagine finding there? If the honest answer was relief, a specific and temporary relief before the goalpost moved again, that was the compensatory wanting. If the answer was a concrete and nameable change in how his daily life actually felt, more time, more flexibility, a specific freedom that was currently constrained, that was the legitimate wanting. The legitimate wanting had a shape. The compensatory wanting was formless because it was not after a thing but after an absence of feeling. He is not sure it can be solved exactly in the way a math problem is solved, definitively, finally, with no residual ambiguity. What he arrived at over time was something more like a practice, the habit of returning, regularly and with honesty, to the question of what enough actually looked like for him, not as a ceiling on ambition, but as an anchor against drift, A reference point he could hold when the machinery of comparison started to move the goalpost again, as it always did and always would. The anchor did not stop the drift, but it gave him something to measure the drift against with, which meant he could choose, sometimes, whether to follow it. He thought about Gerald again, about the phrase he had dismissed at 7 and returned to at 41. I knew what enough looked like a long time ago, with. He understood it differently now, not as resignation, but as a kind of radical clarity. The clarity of a man who had decided, before the decision was made for him, what he was actually working toward, with. Who had refused to let the goalpost move without his consent. Who had found in that refusal not the death of ambition, but a different and more durable kind of satisfaction. The satisfaction of a life that was, with. By his own accounting, genuinely enough, there is one more thing Daniel noticed, small but worth naming. On the evenings when he did not open the real estate tab, when he sat with what he had and let it be enough, with, even temporarily, the quiet that followed was not the quiet of deprivation. It was a different and steadier kind of quiet, with, less populated by the background noise of comparison and calculation and the perpetual forward lean of wanting. He was not sure what to call it exactly, something close to presence, with. Something close to the recognition that the life already underway, the one already in his possession, the one he had been building and saving and protecting for 15 years, with, had more in it than the wanting had ever allowed him to fully see. The wanting had kept him moving, that was its value and its cost. Without it he might not have built what he had. With nothing but it, with, he might never be able to live inside what he had built. The coffee on Daniel's desk had gone cold. He looked at it. He thought about Gerald's truck and Elliot's 3 months and the tab he had just closed, with. He picked up the coffee and drank it anyway, cold as it was. That was the whole of the practice, deciding again not to follow the wanting. Tomorrow it would need to be decided again. But tonight the tab was closed, with. The coffee was finished and the number on the screen was, for now, enough. Chapter 4. The Discipline of Staying, on Building from Confidence, the Intention-Action Gap, with. And what financial maturity actually feels like. Daniel was 43 when he made a decision that had been available to him for years. And the reason it had taken so long was not that he hadn't known what the decision was, with. He opened an investment account on a Wednesday morning in March, transferred an amount that felt uncomfortable but not catastrophic, and chose, with. After a consideration that was longer than strictly necessary but shorter than the 6 years of deliberation that had preceded it, 3 low-cost index funds. He set up automatic contributions for the first of every month, with. He closed the browser. He went to make coffee and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and what he felt was not the satisfaction of a man who had made a brilliant financial move. It was something quieter and more specific, with. The relief of someone who had finally stopped doing the thing they had been doing instead of the thing they knew they should do. He had been ready for this for years. He had known the mechanics. He had read the books. He understood, with genuine clarity, that time in the market matters more than timing the market, that the cost of waiting compounds in the wrong direction just as surely as investment returns compound in the right one. He had known all of this, and he had not acted, and now he had acted. The gap between those two states, knowing and acting, was not bridged by additional information or greater certainty or a finally perfect moment. It was bridged by something else, something he had been slowly building without entirely realizing he was building it. The thing he had been building was a different relationship to the future, not optimism. Daniel was not constitutionally an optimist, and he had become suspicious of financial advice that required optimism as a precondition. What he had developed was something more structural and less emotional, a working trust in the basic durability of forward motion, not certainty that things would go well, a considered bet that staying in the game over time was more likely to serve him than not being in it. This is a distinction that sounds minor and turns out to be enormous, optimism says things will be fine. The considered bet says I don't know if things will be fine, and I am going to act anyway because the alternative, permanent caution, indefinite waiting, Saving without investing has its own cost that I have been paying for years without accounting for it. The cost of caution is one of the least discussed expenses in personal finance. We talk extensively about the cost of bad decisions, the credit card debt, the impulse purchase, the investment that went wrong. We almost never talk, with equivalent seriousness, about the cost of the good decision not made. The cost of the account not opened, the contribution not started, the compounding not begun. These costs are invisible in the way that all opportunity costs are invisible. You cannot point to a line in your bank statement that says amount lost to excessive prudence this month. The money was never there. Its absence is silent. But the absence is real, and it compounds just as faithfully as the presence would have. Daniel had been paying this cost for 6 years. He had calculated it once, with the kind of deliberate honesty that produces numbers you immediately want to argue with. The figure was not catastrophic. He was not ruined, had not missed a once-in-a-lifetime window, had not made any single decision whose consequences were irreversible. But it was real money, real time, a real portion of his working life during which his savings had grown modestly and steadily in accounts that were safe and were not working as hard as they could have been working. He had not lost anything, He had simply failed to gain things he could have gained, and the failure had been quiet enough that he had managed, for years, to not fully see it. What had finally moved him was not, as he had always vaguely assumed it would be, a better argument. He had encountered all the arguments. He had found them all convincing. The thing that moved him was a conversation with his daughter, who was 17 at the time, and who had asked him, without any particular agenda, how investments worked. He had explained compound interest to her with the fluency of someone who had studied it carefully. She had listened and then said, simply, "So you should start as early as possible." He had said yes. She had looked at him with the particular clarity of a 17-year-old who does not yet understand why adults fail to do things they know they should do, and he had recognized in her look the question she was not quite asking, and he had not had an answer that satisfied him. He had opened the account 2 weeks later, There is a concept in behavioral economics called the intention-action gap, the measurable, well-documented distance between what people say they intend to do and what they actually do. It shows up with particular force in financial behavior. In study after study, the overwhelming majority of people who say they intend to save more, invest more, begin building toward retirement, do not do so within any reasonable time horizon after expressing that intention. The gap is not explained by lack of information or absence of motivation. People genuinely intend to do the thing. They simply do not do it, And the explanations for why, the present bias, the friction costs, the psychological distance of future rewards, the very human tendency to treat tomorrow as a reliable container for the things today cannot hold, are by now thoroughly understood. What is less understood, or at least less discussed, is what actually closes the gap. What converts intention into action in a domain where intention alone has proven spectacularly insufficient. For Daniel, the conversion happened in layers over years, and the account opening in March was not a beginning but a culmination. The beginning had been the conversation with Maya when he had first named the fear underneath the hesitation. What followed over the next several years was a slow reconstruction of his relationship to financial decision-making. Not a revolution, but an accumulation of smaller shifts, each of which made the next one slightly more available. The first shift was the one described in that Sunday afternoon conversation, recognizing that he was saving from fear rather than from confidence, and that the distinction mattered not just emotionally but practically. Saving from fear produces behavior that is responsive to feeling rather than anchored in strategy. It accelerates when anxiety is high and stalls when things feel stable. It treats every market movement as a referendum on the wisdom of the original decision. It is exhausting in a way that saving from confidence is not, because it requires continuous emotional management rather than the simple maintenance of a chosen direction. Saving from confidence is not the same as saving from certainty. Daniel had spent years confusing these two things. With certainty is the conviction that things will go well, that the market will rise, that the future will vindicate the present choice. Confidence is something more modest and more durable, the conviction that the direction is sound, with that the strategy has been chosen thoughtfully, that you will be able to tolerate what comes because you have decided in advance what you will do when it comes. With certainty is fragile. It shatters on contact with evidence that things might not be fine. Confidence is flexible. It can accommodate bad news without collapsing because it was never predicated on everything going well. With it was predicated on a direction worth holding. The second shift was learning to separate the decision from the outcome. This sounds simple. It is in practice one of the hardest habits in financial life to build with. Because the culture of investing, the news coverage, the performance tracking, the quarterly statements is entirely organized around outcomes. How did your investments do this month, this quarter, this year? With these are the questions the environment keeps asking, and they are the wrong questions if your time horizon is 20 years. With the right question, is my strategy sound for the goals I have defined over the time horizon I have committed to, is almost never asked because it does not produce a number that changes every day. With and we have built an entire infrastructure around the daily number. Daniel had learned, with difficulty and with the help of a decision journal he had started and abandoned twice, before maintaining consistently on the third attempt, with to evaluate his financial decisions at the moment of making them rather than in the rearview mirror of their outcomes. With a good decision made under conditions of genuine uncertainty can produce a bad outcome through no fault of the decision. A bad decision made carelessly can produce a good outcome through pure luck. With conflating the quality of the decision with the quality of the outcome is how people learn the wrong lessons from their financial experience, reinforcing lucky errors and abandoning sound strategies that temporarily underperformed. With the journal was not a record of outcomes. It was a record of reasoning, and returning to it, in moments when the outcome was tempting him to revise his memory of the original reasoning, had saved him from several expensive reinterpretations of the past. The third shift, the one he had been least prepared for, and that had ultimately mattered most, was developing what he had come to think of as staying power. With not discipline exactly, though discipline was part of it. Staying power is something more particular, the capacity to remain in a position you have chosen through conditions that make remaining uncomfortable, without being moved by the discomfort into abandoning the position. It is the quality that separates the investor who weathers a downturn from the one who does not. And the difference in outcomes over time is enormous. It is also the quality that is least addressed by financial education, because financial education is largely about choosing the right position, and staying power is about what happens after the position has been chosen and the world begins to test it. He had failed at this before. The Tuesday morning he had sold during the downturn was the clearest example, but it was not the only one. He had made changes to his savings allocations in moments of anxiety that he later recognized as emotional decisions dressed in the language of rational ones. He had shifted money out of vehicles that made him nervous into ones that felt safer, and the nervousness had been real, and the safety had been partly illusory, and the cost of the shift, the transaction costs, the tax implication, the disruption of the original allocation, was real and quantifiable and had each time diminished the returns he would otherwise have seen. What he had been doing in those moments, was managing his feelings about his money rather than managing his money. This is a distinction that does not appear on any account statement. It does not show up as a category of expense, but it is one of the most expensive things most people do with their financial lives. The money spent on feeling better about money, on the reactive decisions, the anxiety-driven reallocations, the flight to the familiar when the unfamiliar gets uncomfortable, is money that does not compound, does not grow, does not contribute to the long-term project that all the reading and all the planning had been in service of. There is a particular quality to the decisions Daniel had made in his worst financial moments that he had come to recognize as a signature. They felt, from the inside, like reason. They came with supporting arguments, with data, with references to things he had read. They were persuasive in the specific way that only internally generated arguments can be persuasive, because they had no external advocate, no one to push back with, no friction between the feeling and the justification the feeling was producing. He would feel afraid, and then, within minutes, he would have constructed a case, drawn from real information, framed in real logic, for why the afraid feeling was correct and action was warranted. The fear had put on the clothes of reason, and he had been consistently unable in those early years to tell the difference between fear in its own clothes and fear dressed as analysis. What he had eventually developed, through the journal, through the practice of writing down his reasoning before acting on it, through the discipline of waiting 24 hours before making any financial decision that originated in a feeling of urgency, was the capacity to audit his own arguments, not to dismiss them, not to assume that every anxious thought was wrong, but to ask, with curiosity rather than defensiveness, where did this argument come from? Was it available to me yesterday before the market moved? Would I be making it if the number had gone up instead of down? Is this reasoning or is this rationalization? The questions did not always produce clear answers, but they slowed the process enough that action was less likely to precede reflection. There is an idea that Morgan Housel returns to in different forms throughout his writing on this subject, and it is one that Daniel had found more useful than almost anything else he had read about investing, that the most important financial skill is not intelligence or discipline or even knowledge, but the ability to control your behavior in moments when your behavior most wants to be uncontrolled. When the market falls, when everyone around you is making a different choice than you make, when the story you are hearing makes your strategy sound naive. Those are the moments that separate the outcomes, because those are the moments when the emotional response is sharpest and the cost of following it is highest. Staying power is not passive. This is something Daniel had misunderstood for a long time. He had associated staying with doing nothing, and doing nothing with a kind of financial passivity that felt uncomfortably close to the paralysis he had been trying to move away from. But staying, in the sense he had come to understand it, is an active practice. It requires continuous small decisions not to act, not to sell, not to reallocate, not to respond to the noise. Each of those non-decisions is a decision. Each of them costs something, in terms of the discomfort of holding a position when everything in your emotional environment is telling you to move. And each of them, over time, produces something, the accumulated benefit of a strategy pursued consistently rather than intermittently. He had learned this slowly and at some cost, which is perhaps the only way any of it can be learned. Financial knowledge, accumulated in books and articles and conversations, is one thing. Financial wisdom, the kind that stays in place when the market is doing something alarming, is another. Knowledge is available when things are calm. Wisdom is what remains when things are not. The difference between them is not intelligence. It is the particular education that only comes from having made the mistake, absorbed the consequence, and returned to the position with a clearer understanding of what had actually happened and why. The March account was, in this sense, not a fresh start. It was a continuation, the next chapter of a financial education that had been running, in one form or another, since a kitchen at age 7. Everything that had happened between that kitchen and this Wednesday morning had contributed something. The hesitation, the Tuesday sale, the conversation with Maya, the question his daughter had not quite asked, the journals, the walks taken instead of trades made. None of it had been wasted. Even the failures had been useful, especially the failures. They had taught him what his version of the problem actually looked like, not the generic version described in books, but the specific personal, historically rooted version that lived in his nervous system and expressed itself in particular ways under particular conditions. That knowledge was not available anywhere else. It could not be downloaded. It had to be lived with. Staying also required, Daniel had found, a recalibration of what I measured and when. The monthly account balance check had been for years a source of either reassurance or anxiety depending entirely on what the market had done since the last check. He had been using it as a report card, a periodic verdict on whether his decisions had been correct. This was the wrong use of the information. A monthly account balance tells you almost nothing useful about the quality of a long-term strategy. It tells you what the market did this month, which is interesting but not relevant to a plan whose horizon is 20 years. The relevant question, is this strategy sound for my goals over my time horizon, cannot be answered monthly because monthly data is noise, not signal. But he had been reading it as signal anyway, because it was the number that was most visible and most readily available, and available numbers have a gravitational pull that is very difficult to resist. He had changed this. He still checked. He was not someone who could entirely ignore the numbers, and he no longer tried to be. But he had changed what he was looking for when he checked. He was no longer asking, how am I doing this month? He was asking, is the direction still right, and is the contribution still happening, and is anything I see here actually relevant to the 30-year question? The answers to those questions changed far less frequently than monthly, which meant the checking produced far less anxiety, which meant the checking was no longer primarily an occasion for reactive decision-making. It had become, instead, something closer to maintenance, the brief, regular confirmation that the plan was running and that nothing of genuine structural significance had changed. There is something worth saying about the relationship between financial behavior and identity that rarely gets said directly. The way you handle money over time becomes part of who you believe yourself to be. And that belief, the story you carry about what kind of financial person you are, shapes every subsequent decision in ways that are both powerful and largely invisible. Daniel had spent the first decade of his adult life with an identity that could be summarized, if he was being honest, as someone who knows what he should do and doesn't do it. This identity was not chosen. It had accumulated through a series of hesitations and deferrals and half-starts that each individually seemed like reasonable caution, and that together had calcified into a self-concept, and self-concepts, once established, are self-reinforcing. They generate the very behavior that confirms them. The person who believes they are bad with money makes the decisions of someone who is bad with money, and the decisions confirm the belief, and the belief shapes the next decision, and the cycle continues beneath the level of conscious awareness. What the March account opening had done, what he had not anticipated it doing, was begin to interrupt that cycle, not resolve it, not replace the old identity overnight with a new one, but introduce a competing piece of evidence he had done the thing. It was small by any objective measure, but it was real and it was his, and it did not fit the old story. The old story had to expand slightly to accommodate it, and an identity that has expanded once is slightly more available to expand again. This is how self-concept changes in practice, not through a single dramatic revision, but through the slow accumulation of actions that the old story cannot fully contain, until the story quietly rewrites itself around the weight of what has actually been done. There is also the question of what staying does, over long enough a period, to the relationship between a person and their own financial life. Daniel had noticed something in the 12 months since the account had been open, something he had not expected and could not have predicted from the reading. The regular contribution, arriving on the first of every month without requiring a fresh decision, had begun to feel like a kind of correspondence with his future self. A small, consistent message sent forward in time saying, I have not forgotten about you, I am still working on this. The message was financial in form, but not entirely financial in meaning. It was, in some way, he found difficult to articulate precisely, a practice of care, not the care that responds to crisis, but the quieter and more sustaining kind that shows up reliably in ordinary months and build something that crisis response alone could never build with. He thought about his daughter, who was now 18 and had opened her own investment account with the money she had earned the previous summer. She had asked him, setting it up, what she should do if the market went down with. He had thought about all the things he knew and all the things he had learned at cost, and he had said, "You will feel like selling. That feeling is real, and it is not information, it is just the feeling with. The information is in what you decided when you were not having the feeling. Stay with that." She had nodded with the particular nod of someone who has heard something and does not yet know if they believe it. He understood with. He had not believed it either, the first several times he had needed to. The account he had opened in March was 12 months old now. It had gone down twice in that period, once modestly, once in a way that had produced, with, on one particular evening, the familiar stirring of the older system. He had not sold. He had looked at the number, felt the feeling, gone for a walk, and come back to find the number unchanged and the feeling diminished with. It was not a triumph, it was, he thought, approximately what financial maturity looked like from the inside. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something beside the fear, with something that knew the difference between a feeling and a reason. He had not figured everything out. He did not expect to. There were still decisions ahead that he would not make perfectly, with strategies he would doubt at exactly the wrong moments, numbers that would produce feelings he had not yet learned to sit with. The project of building a financial life was not, he had come to understand, with a problem to be solved once and then maintained. It was a practice like any other practice worth keeping, requiring regular renewal, honest accounting of where it had lapsed, with, and the willingness to begin again without excessive self-judgment when beginning again was what was called for. The coffee was hot this time. He drank it while it was hot. Outside, with the March light was doing what March light does in the late afternoon, going slightly golden, slightly tentative, as if testing whether the season had really changed. He thought about the account, with the contributions scheduled for the 1st of next month, the strategy he had chosen and written down and would return to when returning to it was what was needed. He thought about the kitchen at age 7, with and Maya's observation on that Sunday afternoon and the Tuesday he had sold and the Wednesday he had finally stayed. The Wednesday felt different from the Tuesday, not certain, not triumphant, with just different in the specific way that a decision made from a chosen direction feels different from a decision made from fear. He was still learning to tell them apart. But he was getting better at it, and getting better at it, with he had found, was the whole of the work. Chapter 5, What Money is Actually For, on presence, the armor we build, with, and arriving at the life that was always here. Daniel was 51 the afternoon he sat down in the backyard of the house he had lived in for 11 years and understood, without particular fanfare, what money had always been for, with. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of afternoon that arrives without announcing itself as significant, and is significant anyway. His daughter was in her 2nd year of graduate school in another city, with his savings were in reasonable order, not spectacular but solid, the product of 15 years of imperfect but continuous effort. He had taken the afternoon off with no particular plan, which was still, even now, with slightly uncomfortable for him. The old urgency did not disappear entirely, it simply became quieter over time. He had made tea, he was sitting in a chair that needed repainting, with the light was doing something specific with the leaves on the maple in the corner of the yard, and he was watching it with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere more important to be. He was not wealthy, with, by any measure that would register externally. He was not free from financial considerations, not exempt from the ordinary pressures of a life lived without exceptional fortune. But he was, in that afternoon, with genuinely free in a way that had taken him most of his adult life to build and most of his adult life to understand. Not free from constraint, free within it, with free to sit in a chair on a Thursday afternoon and watch light move through leaves without the background noise of financial anxiety that had been his companion at varying volumes for as long as he could remember, with The noise was not entirely gone. He did not expect it to be, and he had stopped expecting it to be, which was itself a kind of progress. What had changed was his relationship to it, the way it no longer commanded his full attention no longer organized his inner weather the way it once had. There had been years when the anxiety had been the dominant weather, the condition against which everything else was experienced, the persistent hum that made everything slightly harder than it needed to be. Now it was present the way an old scar is present, there, visible when you look for it, occasionally tender in cold weather, no longer determining the shape of every movement or the color of every afternoon. He had been thinking, in the weeks before that Thursday, about what he would say if someone asked him what he had learned, not about investing. He had opinions on that, useful ones, and he was willing to share them. About money itself, about what it had turned out to be over the course of a life spent in a complicated relationship with it. He had been trying to find the formulation that was honest rather than tidy, that captured the real texture of the thing rather than the version that resolved cleanly into advice. What he kept coming back to was this, money is not a destination. It never was. He had spent decades treating it as one, as the thing he was working toward, the condition whose achievement would produce the life he wanted. This was understandable, it was the framework the culture offered, and he had taken it up without examining it, the way you take up a great many frameworks in early adulthood, before you have enough experience to evaluate them. The framework said, accumulate enough and then live. The life was downstream of the number. Get the number right and the life would follow. What he had learned at significant cost and over considerable time was that the framework had it backward, the life is not downstream of the money. The money is in service of the life, the specific, particular, irreplaceable life you are actually living, not the life you will live once the conditions are finally right, And the conditions are never finally right. They are always becoming. There is always another threshold, another milestone, another reason to defer the living in favor of the preparing. The preparing is necessary. It is also, if allowed to consume everything, a way of never arriving anywhere. He had arrived. Not at the end of something. He did not experience the afternoon as a conclusion, but at a place that felt, for the first time in his adult life, like a present tense he was actually inhabiting rather than a present he was passing through on the way to something else. This was new. This was what he had been building toward without knowing it was what he was building toward, through all the years of hesitation and revision and honest accounting, not a number, a quality of presence, an ability to be in his own life in the ordinary moments of it, without the perpetual forward lean of the anxiety that had always been pulling him toward the next thing. There is a conversation about money that almost never happens, and its absence is not accidental, It is the conversation about what money is actually in service of, not as an abstract philosophical question, but as a concrete and personal one, asked with the specificity that makes abstract questions suddenly real, what do you want your days to feel like? What kind of attention do you want to be free to give, and to what? What would you do on a Tuesday or a Thursday if the financial anxiety were quiet enough to let you hear the answer, These questions are not asked in most financial planning conversations. They are not asked because they are difficult to quantify, and financial planning is organized around quantities, but they are, in many ways, the only questions that matter. The quantities are in service of them. Without them, the quantities have no direction. You are saving toward a number rather than toward a life. And the difference between those two projects is enormous, Daniel had not arrived at these questions easily. He had resisted them, actually, for a long time, partly because they felt uncomfortably close to the kind of self-help language he was suspicious of, and partly because he had, for years, confused the absence of financial anxiety with the presence of a good life. He had assumed that once the anxiety was quiet, the good life would reveal itself, obvious and accessible, requiring no further inquiry. What he found was that the anxiety, when it quieted, revealed not a pre-existing good life, but an open space in which a good life could be built. If he had been thinking about what to build, if he had been asking all along with what the money was actually for, he had begun asking seriously and with real effort in his mid-40s. He had done it the same way he had done other things that mattered. By writing, by returning to what he had written with, by noticing the difference between what he said he wanted and what his behavior suggested he actually wanted. The gap between the stated answer and the behavioral answer is always informative with. A person who says they want more free time but fills every available hour with work is telling you, in their behavior, something truer than what they say. Daniel had been that person. He had said he wanted time and space with, and the freedom to be present. And he had been for years the person who had structured his life so comprehensively around the management of financial anxiety that the time and space and presence had very little room to exist with. The question that the beginning had planted, why the saving had felt less like achievement and more like armor, had taken the better part of a decade to answer fully. And the answer, when it finally came, was not complicated with. The saving had felt like armor because it was armor. It had been, from the beginning, a response to the 7-year-old understanding that the ground could shift, that safety was not guaranteed, with that the careful people were not safe from the things that happened to careless people. That understanding was not wrong. The ground can shift. Safety is not guaranteed, with. But the armor that was built in response to that understanding had been designed for a different war. A war that had mostly ended with, or at least changed shape so completely that the original armor no longer fit the threat it was made to address. What he had learned to build in place of the armor was something more like a home with. Not a physical home, though he had that too, the house with the backyard and the maple and the chair that needed repainting. A home in the sense of a stable interior orientation toward his own financial life with. A place inside himself where the money question had been answered well enough that it no longer needed to be asked constantly, no longer needed to hover at the edge of every decision and every pleasant afternoon with. The home was not perfect, but it was livable, it was his with. And he had built it not in spite of everything that had happened, but out of it, out of the hesitation and the Tuesday sale and the Maya conversation and the March account and all the ordinary mornings of deciding again to stay with. Near the end of his exploration of what money can and cannot do, that the highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say I can do whatever I want today, not whatever I can afford, with whatever I want. The freedom is not primarily financial, it is temporal and psychological. The freedom from the obligation to do things you do not want to do in exchange for money you need to do things you do with. Daniel had read this years before he understood it. He had nodded at it the way you nod at something that sounds right before you know from the inside what right feels like. Now he knew what it felt like from the inside with was this Thursday afternoon, tea cooling, light on leaves, no particular obligation, the accounts not checked today, not because he was avoiding them, but because checking them was not what this afternoon was for, with. The money was where it was, doing what it was doing, in service of a life that was at this moment being fully lived. The money was not the point, the afternoon was the point, with. The money had made the afternoon possible, had made the space for it, had reduced the pressure that would otherwise have made the sitting too costly to justify, and then had stepped back, which is what money at its best does, with. It creates conditions. It does not fill them. He had understood something, gradually and then all at once in the way that slow understandings sometimes arrive, about what he had been afraid of all those years, with. He had not been afraid of poverty, not exactly, though poverty was part of it. He had been afraid of the feeling that had been in the kitchen at age 7, the feeling of something important being outside his control, with, of the ground being subject to forces that he could not predict and could not prevent. Money had been his attempt to put enough solid ground beneath him that the shifting could not reach him. The attempt was not irrational. It was also, with, finally, insufficient, not because the money had failed him, but because the thing he had been trying to protect against was not ultimately a financial threat. It was the fundamental condition of being alive. It was impermanence, and no amount of money can insure against impermanence. It can only at its best give you enough stability to be present to the life you have while you have it. This was the thing he had been trying to get to. Not safety, exactly, presence. The capacity to be in his own life without the anxiety about the life consuming the life itself. He had thought, for years, that enough money would produce this presence automatically, that once the number was right, the presence would follow. He had learned that it was the other way around. Presence was the practice. It had to be built the same way the savings had been built, gradually, imperfectly, through regular small decisions, to pay attention to what was actually here, rather than what might be needed later. The two practices had turned out to be more related than he had initially understood. The financial discipline and the discipline of presence were not separate projects. They were the same project approached from different angles. Both required the same core capacity, the ability to stay in a chosen direction when the feeling of the moment was pushing toward a different one. To hold the long view when the short view was loudest, to trust the plan made in the calm moment over the impulse generated in the anxious one. He had been building this capacity in his financial life for 15 years, What he had not fully seen was that he had been building it everywhere else at the same time, There is something specific that happens when a person finally stops treating their financial life as a problem to be solved and begins treating it as a practice to be maintained, The problem framing produces a particular kind of tension. The sense that you are not yet where you need to be, that arrival is contingent on resolution, that the current state is a temporary discomfort to be endured until the problem yields. The practice framing produces something else, the recognition that this is simply what the work looks like, ongoing and ordinary, and that the ongoing ordinariness of it is not a sign that something has gone wrong, but a sign that something is working. Practices do not resolve, they continue. And in continuing, they build something that resolution, the fantasy of the problem finally solved, could not. Daniel had come to understand his financial life as a practice in this sense. Not a project with an endpoint, not a problem with a solution, but something more like a relationship, requiring regular attention, honest accounting, the willingness to show up imperfectly, and the willingness to repair what had frayed. He had been in this relationship for his entire adult life, He had been for much of it a difficult partner, avoidant, occasionally reactive, prone to managing feeling rather than managing the thing itself. He had gotten better. He was still getting better, The getting better did not have a finish line, it had instead a direction, and the direction held consistently over years, had produced the Thursday afternoon, and the maple, and the cold tea, and the quiet that was not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of someone who had, finally, arrived somewhere worth being. He would not have called it peace exactly, The word felt too static for what it actually was, which was more like an earned steadiness, a quality of groundedness that had been built from the unstable material of his own history, and was therefore his in a way that nothing given or inherited could have been. He had made it, not alone Meyer and his daughter and his father's note and all the books and all the teachers whose names he would never know had contributed, but the making had required him. His particular hesitation, his particular fear, his particular version of the old pattern, and his particular effort to understand it, all of it had been necessary, all of it had produced this, There is also something worth saying about what changes in the people around you once you have made this shift. Once the financial anxiety has quieted enough that the attention it was consuming becomes available for other things, Daniel noticed it in the quality of his conversations. He had become, over the years, a genuinely better listener, not because he had decided to become one, but because there was simply more of him available for the listening, The part that had once been perpetually rehearsing the financial worry, running the background calculation of whether things were going to be okay, had been, if not silenced, then at least reduced to a hum he could set aside for the duration of a real conversation with a real person, He could be present to other people in the way he was slowly learning to be present to his own life, without the distraction of the ongoing anxiety pulling focus toward the interior management of his own situation. This had changed his relationships in ways he had not anticipated and could not entirely measure. The noise had cost him not just money, not just the returns foregone, the strategies delayed, the hesitations that compounded in the wrong direction. It had cost him presence. It had cost him attention. It had cost him the full occupation of his own life, and those were the costs that no account statement had ever shown him, and that no financial plan had ever factored in, and that only the Thursday afternoon quiet, ordinary, genuinely enough, had finally made visible and nameable, and at last his to reclaim. He thought about all the people he had known who had more money than he did, and less of what the Thursday afternoon represented. People for whom the number had grown large and the life had not grown correspondingly fuller, who had achieved by any external measure the conditions for a good life and had found themselves unable to inhabit those conditions because the habit of striving, of forward-leaning anxiety, had become so thoroughly their mode of operation that rest felt like danger and presence felt like waste. He did not judge them. He had been, in his own proportion, that person. He understood the mechanism from the inside. What he had found, sitting in his backyard chair, was that the cage the accumulation builds has an exit that is not financial. It was not a number that opened it. It was a question, the one he had finally learned to ask and to answer honestly. What is this for? Not the money. The day. This particular configuration of light and tea and unhurried attention. The answer on a Thursday in September was, it is for this. It is for exactly this. There is a final thing worth naming, because it is the thing that most surprised him and that he had not read anywhere, and that he suspects is true for more people than discuss it openly. The relief he had expected to feel once the financial anxiety quieted was real, but it was not the primary thing he felt. What he felt primarily was something closer to grief. A quiet, honest grief for the years in which the anxiety had been loudest, for the afternoons he had not been able to sit in the way he was sitting now, for the conversations he had not been fully present for the ordinary goodness of his own life that had been available all along, and that he had been for so long too preoccupied to fully receive. The grief was not debilitating. It was appropriate. It was the acknowledgement that something real had been lost, not to catastrophe but to preoccupation, and that the loss was worth naming honestly before moving forward. He named it. He sat with it for a while. And then, as grief does when it has been given sufficient space and honesty, it passed through and left behind something clear, a sharpened appreciation for what was present now, and a quiet commitment to remain present to it as long as he was able. There were things he wished he had understood earlier. He wished he had opened the investment account at 37 instead of 43. He wished he had had the Maya conversation at 28 instead of 34. He wished he had understood earlier that the hesitation was not caution but fear, and that the fear, though real, was responding to a past that was no longer the present. He held these wishes without excessive self-reproach, which was itself something he had learned. The practice of accounting for the past without being consumed by it, of seeing the mistakes clearly enough to learn from them without seeing them so harshly that the seeing became its own impediment. What he did not wish was that the journey had been shorter, not because the length was pleasant, because the length was the education. Financial wisdom is not transferable in the way that financial information is. The internalization requires experience, the real kind, lived in real time, with real stakes and real emotional texture. It requires the time that Daniel had taken and the cost he had paid, and the accumulation of ordinary days in which he had practiced imperfectly, the things that slowly became the way he actually operated. The light had shifted while he was sitting there. The maple had gone from bright to shadowed, which meant the afternoon had moved further than he had noticed. His tea was cold. He did not get up immediately. He sat with the cold tea and the shifted light and the particular quality of a Thursday afternoon in late September when there is nowhere more important to be with. And he thought about the 7-year-old in the kitchen and the man of 51 in the backyard chair and the long, imperfect, genuinely useful distance between them. The 7-year-old had understood something real with. The ground can shift, the money can disappear. The smile that is not quite a smile means something. These were true things and they had never stopped being true with, and the understanding of them had driven everything that came after. The saving, the hesitation, the armor, the slow dismantling of the armor, the building of something more livable in its place. The 7-year-old had not been wrong with. He had simply been building with the only materials available at the time. The man of 51 had different materials. He had the history and the cost of it, and the specific education that can only be assembled from living with. He had the accounts and the strategy and the decision journal and the practice of staying. He had the Maya conversation and his daughter's look and his father's note in the folder and the March morning and the walk instead of the trade with. He had all of it laid down over years like sediment, forming something solid enough to stand on, not a guarantee, a foundation. The kind that holds not because nothing will ever shake it with, but because it was built to flex rather than to shatter, to absorb what comes rather than to pretend what comes will not. He picked up the cold tea and drank it slowly, without hurrying it along. He did not go inside right away with. The question that had opened at the beginning, why the saving had felt like armor rather than achievement, had been answered now with, not as a theory but as a lived understanding that had taken up residence in him and would not need to be re-explained. He had been saving to feel safe. He had learned to build something better than safety. He had learned to feel with, on an ordinary Thursday in a chair that needed repainting, that the ground beneath him was solid enough. Not perfect, solid enough. And solid enough, it turned out, was the thing he had always been looking for. He had simply not known, for a very long time, that it was something you build rather than something you find.